Okay, we're going to be in John chapter 2. So at this point, Jesus has already been baptized. Jesus has already been through the wilderness and done all his being tempted and all that kind of thing. And he's picked his disciples. And now, in verse 1, it says, on the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And Jesus also was invited, even his disciples, to the wedding. Now, Cana is a city that's kind of halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea. It's about 15 miles east of the Mediterranean, and about 12 miles west of the Sea of Galilee. So that's about where Cana is. And it's close to Nazareth and Capernaum and those cities around Lake Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. But when it starts off, it says on the third day. It's talking about the third day after the events of chapter 1. Because when this was written, there were no chapters and there were no verses. So it was all just one big story, or one big letter, basically. So when you see something like that on the third day, it's talking about from the previous of what's being said. And so this is where they're at. And Jesus was invited, and his mother was invited, and it's customary for the disciples to follow their rabbi. So when Jesus was invited, his disciples were invited as well, and so forth. And this story that we're going to talk about, a lot of us have heard, it's where Jesus turned water into wine. And this is the first of many stories suggesting that Jesus is always around those who are having a good time. Every time they were having a get-together, and throughout the Gospels, Jesus was invited. And so Jesus didn't spoil the good time. He was part of it. And a lot of times today, people say, well, I don't want to become a Christian because it would ruin my life, my nightlife, or, but if you have Jesus with you, then your good times are better times than it would be if you're trying to do things on your own. And so here's a wedding, and in Jewish culture, a wedding was the best party of all. I mean, the whole city was invited to the wedding. It wasn't just family. It's like the whole city came, all the surrounding areas, and it was a huge, huge feast, and it lasted for about 7 days. The wedding feast lasted about 7 days. And it was up to the host to provide enough food and drink for everybody for those 7 days.
That's a lot of food and drink.
That's a lot of food and drink.
We know, because we're about to have a wedding feast.
Yeah, but ours is only going to be for a day.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
One meal.
Yeah, one meal. Can you imagine 7 days worth? And if a couple didn't have enough food or wine for that time, it was a disgrace.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Cana is such a small knit community, it would probably never be forgiven or forgotten. And if they, so it was a really big deal when they ran out of wine, because that would have been a disgrace to the family. It would have been a disgrace to the people getting married, and it just people would look down on them for the rest of their lives, basically. They're the ones who didn't have enough food during their feast and things like that.
That's pretty petty.
It is. It is.
It
is.
Really?
But the fact that Jesus was invited to this wedding had several implications. One, the invitation of Jesus to this wedding says something about the kind of man Jesus was. Everybody liked him, at this time. Now, when he started preaching, he started making enemies, but right now, I mean, he was a great guy. Of course, he was always a great guy, but people just enjoyed being around him. The invitation of Jesus to this wedding, says something about the presence of Jesus at weddings. I mean, when you get married, we should have Jesus invited to our wedding and throughout our lives. A lot of people don't, and that's why America today, our divorce rate's so high. It's because we tend to not invite Jesus into our weddings and our family.
Used to, you had to have counseling with your pastor.
Yeah.
I did. Did you have counseling before?
But
you got
there's no
married?
judgment here
Yeah.
Well,
on
no.
people that are divorced, because we've both been
Right,
divorced.
yeah. Yeah, and I'm not judging people who get divorced. It's just, you know, when
Even though you're married the second time, you have
Yeah.
God. You
Yeah.
decided
Yeah.
God this time,
and
so.
we can tell the difference when you put Jesus here in a wedding and when Jesus is not
Sure.
there in a wedding. There's a huge difference.
Yeah.
I mean, we can vouch for that from experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, like tonight, you didn't break your word.
Now I have
You know,
Jesus.
drink water, eat.
Yeah. The invitation of Jesus to this wedding says something about what happens when we invite Jesus into all our events. You know, some people think that you can't have fun unless you're drunk. That's something, you know, a lot of times. No, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with drinking. Some people drink. But the Bible does say don't get drunk. So there's a difference there. And so when we invite Jesus into those events, we can have a better time than, you know, if we just go out and just overdo things. Okay, so at this point in time, this was fresh off, like I said, his most disturbing personal conflict to date, the temptation in the wilderness. That was a tough time for him. You know, he spent 40 days into the wilderness, tempted of Satan. Command these stones to be made bread. You know, dive off the temple. God will protect you. You know, and I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. And those are just the three recorded. You know, he spent 40 days there. I bet there was more than 3 that just were not recorded.
Yeah.
And so, it would have been a trying time. And that shows kind of how we are before we come to Christ. Our life is like a wilderness. You know, we have a tough time. Things don't always tend to work out.
Find your way.
You find your way through it. And then when we meet Jesus in that wilderness, then he walks out with us. So, that's kind of how you do that. And a marriage is a marriage of joy, that time of joy. And so that's kind of what this is. You left the wilderness to a time of joy. And so his ministry hasn't quite started yet during this point. And, he's got his disciples and things like that, but he hadn't actually started his public ministry yet. And so this will be kind of the first things that he does. And so this is Cana's kind of a country town. Out, it's away from the bustling Jerusalem and things like that. And so this is where he kind of went after his wilderness days. There's no mention of Joseph, so he probably has passed away before this point. And this could be also a reason why Jesus was still with his mother at this point, because in this culture it is the job of the oldest son to take care of the mother when the father passes away. And so he didn't start his ministry till he was 30, and that could have been, that Bible doesn't say, we don't know, but it could have been he stayed with his mother until his brothers and sisters were old enough to be able to tend to the things before he started his memory, because he was doing his eldest son duties of taking care of the family.
Lee, I had a question.
Mhm.
I wondered about, I know it was God's will for the 40 days wandering in the wilderness, but is there any lead up to that or thought in the Bible about it that leads to say why it was 40 days? Why wasn't it 30 or?
Well, I think it has to do with, like in the Old Testament, it rained upon the earth for 40 days, 49. So Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. I think there's a correlation there that God.
40 years for
Yeah.
the Israelites in the desert.
Yeah, 40 years for the Israelites in the desert.
There's a lot of,
I think that was all foreshadowing how long, Jesus was going to be in the wilderness too. So.
When I think of a wilderness, I think of trees and all that. That's just rock.
It was
Desert.
shrubs and
Yeah.
rocks is what it
Yeah.
was. Desert. It's basically like
you
a
ever
desert.
seen pictures of Jerusalem
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah.
the area there?
I have some rocks from Jerusalem. My
Kinda-
mother-in-law brought that. It's
Kinda
dry
arid,
and
arid.
Area,
Yes,
yeah.
very much.
But I think it could be that Israel had to spend 40 years in the wilderness because of their sin.
Right.
Jesus spent 40 days to show and came out without sin to kind of to show, because once again, he's still trying to show us the way to live. So they're spending it in 40 years because of their sin. He spent 40 days and showed that it could be done without sin. So,
And it was perfect sacrifice.
yeah.
Hmm.
And he had to be tempted. The Bible says that he was tempted in every way that we were. So that's why I said I think it was more than just those three.
No, yeah.
Because he was tempted in every way that we are, but yet he was without sin. So, and if you're tempted, that means you really are thinking about it. So he, the things that Satan was saying really looked good, but Jesus still said no. And so I think that, that kind of, maybe it took 40 days for all those temptations to take place.
Yeah.
So like I said, Jesus had younger half-brothers and sisters. I mean, they weren't full-blood because Jesus was the Son of God. But he took care of his mother, doing the elder son duties until, they were old enough. Verse 3. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "What have I to do with you, woman? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it."
She didn't even acknowledge it.
Now, yeah, that's seems kind of cold calling your mother a woman, but I mean, there's many theories as to why he did that. I mean, a lot of the theologians said it wasn't derogatory, like it would be for us today. But maybe he said that he was about to start his ministry, so he was trying to transition from the Son to the Son of God, so he had to distance himself from that to be able to fulfill his ministry.
Rather than calling her mother.
Yeah. He probably called her mother all his life, and he had to distance himself, saying, "Okay, now my job is finished as the Son, and now I must focus on what the Father wants me to
Now
do."
you wonder.
Yeah, so,
My Bible says, "Dear woman." That's
Yeah.
not our problem.
yeah. Why would Mary care about the wine? I mean, she, no one knows. It could be that she was one of the organizers, so because she knew about it before the master of the feast. So she could have been one of the organizers, and no one really knows. But
Or she just might not want them to be ashamed.
it'd be a shame, but but she knew about it before the hosts did. She knew about it before the master of the feast did. So maybe she was interacting with it somehow, but no one really knows. And this is kind of what I was talking about why would running out of wine be a problem? In today's day and age, we run out of wine, we run to the store and grab some. But here in those days, wine was the only other drink but water. I mean, you either had water or you had wine. There was nothing in between. And running out of wine at wedding, and serving water only, that was a sign of, a shame. Shame, yeah, disrespect and shame. And so that's why Mary was real concerned about the wine and things was, the shame and the things like that. And let's see. And so she went to Jesus, and he said he didn't rebuke her. He rebuked her and said, "Woman," but it wasn't derogatory. And he's probably, like I said, trying to separate himself from the human vessel who brought him into the world to now God who has a purpose for his life. And he knew it was time for his ministry, and so he had to separate. Because when his ministry started, he had to leave his mother. And so he couldn't be anchored down by earthly things at that point, even though it was his mother. But, like I said, he hadn't started his ministry yet, and he said, "My hour has not yet come." That's why we know he hadn't started his ministry yet. But what do you think he meant by "my hour has not yet come"?
Well, he said that a couple of times in future instances when he did miracles. He would tell, like when he healed the lepers, he told them not to tell anybody. And he would say that a couple of different times. because he knew his appointed time to die on the cross was not yet come, and so he didn't want people to know exactly who he was, or to start that timeline before it was time.
Because when he started doing miracles and things like that, showing who he really is, that was when the religious leaders plotted to kill him. And he knew that his hour was not yet, so he couldn't come out public yet. And not only that, he never publicly came out and said, "I'm the Messiah," until his triumphal entry on the donkey coming in. That's when he let the crowd, Hosanna to the King of David. Up until that point, he always told people, don't tell anybody, because his hour was not yet. There was a appointed time for him to be revealed as the Messiah, and there was a appointed time for him to be crucified. And they had to fit perfectly with what the Old Testament scriptures prophesied would happen. And so, saying my time is not yet, saying, it's not time for me to publicly come out and, and just do miracles in front of everybody. Doesn't mean he didn't do miracles, just meant he didn't want to do it in front of just everybody and everything like that.
It's kind of like living in the field, there's no secret.
Yeah, no secrets, yeah. But what did Mary do after Jesus said that? What did she say?
Whatever he tells you to
Yeah,
do.
exactly. Whatever he says do it.
So basically, she was like, it might not be your time, but it's your time.
Yeah. But he says, "Not my time," but she immediately turned to the servant and says, "Whatever he tells you to do it." Mary's words in the Bible are few, but the words she speaks, they always point to the glory of Christ or glory of God, and that's what she's telling them here. Do what he says. I mean, wherever he says. So it's good to pay attention to her words that are recorded, and because they, like I said, they glorify Christ and not her herself. And a lot of us, or not a lot of us, but there's religions out there who put Mary up on this pedestal almost as if she's deity herself. And I'm
Pray
sure
to Mary.
do what?
Pray to
Yeah,
Mary.
pray to her.
Yeah.
When they should just read this and say, whatever Jesus
You
said,
don't
do,
have to
that's
pray
what we
to
do.
Mary.
Yeah. And so, and we know, which religion that is.
Yes.
And,
And it's my opinion that a lot of people within that religion are Christians and do have a relationship with Jesus, but some don't. Just
Well,
like
that's
in our
probably-
religion.
Well, I started to say that's probably in every.
Yeah, just like
Yeah.
in every religion.
Well,
Well, not every religion.
so what else does the Bible quote Mary as having said after this? Nothing.
She cries.
Yeah, but it doesn't.
She cries, yeah,
It
that's
doesn't
true.
quote her
It's
saying
always-
anything else after this. So her last words were, "Whatever he says do it." And where do we find his instructions?
The
His
Bible.
word. Yeah, his word. And if we don't spend time in this, then we don't know what he says. So how are we going to be able to do it? Don't take my word for it. Don't take Bobby's word for it. We need to read the Bible ourselves and then test what is taught or what is said to this and make sure it fits. And because whatever he says is what we're supposed to do. So that's where we can get from Mary saying whatever he says do it. All right, verse 6. Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone for the purification of the Jews, each one able to hold 2 or 3 gallons.
Mine says 20 to 30 gallons.
Yeah, maybe 20 or 30 different translations.
That's a
They
big
were
difference.
huge.
Big difference between
Yeah.
2 or 3 and
Yeah.
20 and 30.
They were huge. I think it was a mistranslation from gallons to supposed to be something else. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." Now, he just told them to fill the water pots with water. He didn't tell them how much to put in there. He just said, fill them with water. Now, if you have kids like Mine, you don't fill it with water, you may get it about 3/4, half. But it says they filled it to the brim. So that means all the way to the top. Now, what are these water pots? Were they for the wine? No, it says that they were for purification of the Jews. This is what they washed their dishes in. This is what they washed their hands. They drew water from it to wash their feet, all that kind of stuff. Because in the Jewish culture, you had to have everything washed before you could eat. You couldn't eat with your hands unless you were clean. And so that's what these pots were used for, Jewish purifications.
Kosher.
Yeah. And but they filled it up, and so that's so they knew what was in it. They knew it was water. And something interesting about filling it up to the brim, that means Jesus couldn't add anything to it. So you couldn't add stuff to change it into wine because it was filled to the brim. But Jesus, could he have just filled the water up himself?
Sure.
Yeah. Could he just said, command it to be full of water and automatically it was full of water? Sure. But he wanted to share the blessing and the miracle with these servants. And he does that with us. He wants us to share the blessing. When we share Christ with somebody and they come to know Christ, do we not get that blessing as well? Do we not
Sure.
feel overjoyed that they... Now, did we have to be the one to share Christ with them? No, but Jesus allowed us to share in that blessing for when they came to know him, or a need was met in their lives. He uses us to meet that need, even though he could do it without us. But he chooses to give us a unique place in the blessing, with it. So he knew what he was going to do, but he wanted to share it with them. Servants didn't do the miracle, but their efforts alone were completely insufficient. They just filled it with water. Okay, it didn't do anything but stand there with the water until Jesus acted upon it. But because of their obedience, they shared that joy after seeing it turned into wine. And so that means that Jesus, or that God works through the lives of his people, for us to have blessings as well as bless others. He blesses us to bless others. That's what I like to say. A lot of times we get abundance so we can share with others. And so, that's what this is at. All right. And then this is what Jesus said in verse 8. And he said to them, "Draw out now and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it, and when the master of the feast had tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. Now, they were going to be in deep trouble for bringing washing water instead of wine to the master of the feast if they just brought washing water. They would get in lots of trouble. So this took faith on their behalf to do this. Now, the Bible doesn't say when he changed the water to wine. Did he change the water and wine in the pots? Or was it after they dipped it out, did the water become wine? We don't know. Did it take their faith and then Jesus changed it before, or did he change it before they did it? It's something to think about. But they obeyed Jesus and the water turned to wine. And Jesus insisted that the miracle be put to the test. He had them take it to the authority to taste it and make sure it was right. Jesus knew it was right, but he took it to the proper authority of the feast, which was the master of the feast. And Jesus did that throughout his ministry. Even when, when he was being questioned, they were questioning him about his authority and things like that. They were the authority of the temple at the time, but they were inspecting Jesus, and we'll get to that more when it comes to that point. but he always had them, take it to the authority of the time. Like when he healed the lepers, go show the priest, and those type of things. And not because his miracle needed to be proven, but just because he was taking it to the proper authority at that time to show that it is what it is and not some parlor trick, that type of thing.
It also could be respect for the authority
Mhm.
too.
Yeah.
Showing that God puts authorities in place. Go back to what Gideon was saying.
Yeah, exactly. And see, the master of the feast only knew that it was good wine. He didn't know where it came from. He didn't know it was a miracle. He just tasted it and knew it was good. And he was not told exactly, or we're not told exactly how Jesus performed that miracle or when he did, like I said. But we do know that it was good wine because the authority said, that's good wine. Verse 10. And he said to them, the master of the feast said to them, every man sets out good wine first, and then when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. So not only was did Jesus say it was the best wine. So, and what that tells us is in our lives, the good is good is yet to come. Okay, what God has for us is better than what we have now, or what we started with. And that's what we need to think about when we're having tough times. The good is yet to come. Because God, always works things out for the good of those that love Him and are called according to His purpose. And God can take a bad situation and turn it good, even when we don't understand. And I've seen that so many times. And we saw it at the church. I can't remember the person's name, but they had the car wreck, and that was a horrific time. But now he's going around sharing Christ. God took that bad situation, that wreck, that could have killed him. But now he's turned it into, this is an opportunity for me to share what God has done for me. Do you remember that? They were up in Newcastle or whatever. He come to Lake Church and spoke. His dad, I can't remember his name.
Oh, the boy.
Yeah.
I remember.
Yeah, I can't remember his name.
Caleb.
Caleb, that's it. So God took that bad situation and turned it good. So
He was paralyzed
Yeah.
at one point.
brain injury or
Brain
something.
injury.
Yeah. So what lesson does the obedience of His servants, and most of us, the Nike slogan, just do it, have for us? When God tells us to do something, just do it. We don't have to understand it. We don't have to see the end result or the end picture of it. If God tells us to do something and we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, His word confirms it, we know it's God telling us, just do it. Because the best is yet to come.
Amen.
The servants filled the water pots with water. They didn't see the end results when they were doing it. But then when the water was changed to wine, the master of the feast, this is the best wine. And that's, that'll be us in the future. We go through tough times, but on the other side is the best is yet to come. Even if it goes against your logic, if it goes against your knowledge, if it goes against your desires, if God says do it, it's better to obey. Because who knows more, us or God? Isaiah 55:9 says, as for the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. So when we think we know everything, God says, you just see that much of it. And so, just when God tells us to do it, even if we don't understand why, do it. I'm sure the servants are like, why are we filling this with water? But they did, and and it turned to wine.
Isaiah 54?
55:9.
Oh, 55:9?
Yeah, Isaiah 55:9.
55:9?
Yeah. So how do you know what God wants you to do? How do we know that?
The Holy Spirit speaks to you.
Okay, the Holy Spirit speaks to us.
Other people that are godly people speak to you.
Okay, sometimes other people, godly people speak to us.
The Bible.
The Bible.
You may even have a dream.
It might have a dream. What happens if one of those other ways, and you're almost sure it was God, but then when you read here, it contradicts what the Bible says?
Probably not, right?
Will God ever
No.
contradict His word?
No.
No. So if something that you're almost sure was God, but then you read this and you find out that this is different,
Then you're wrong.
then you're wrong. Not the Bible.
Right.
Okay? God never contradicts His word. And an example of that, and I've heard this from people. God sent me that this guy or girl into my life, but he's married.
No.
No, God didn't send that person into your life.
It's funny you said that. I had a conversation just like that. one
Yeah.
time.
But I mean,
If they're married, they're
Yeah.
not, they can't
Right.
leave.
Yeah, God didn't send them into your life if
No.
they're married.
It's literally one of the 10 Commandments.
Literally, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So verse 11 says, Jesus did this beginning of signs in Cana of Galilee and revealed His glory, and the disciples believed in Him. So John is telling us this was his first miracle. The beginning, he calls them signs, but they're miracles. This is the beginning of miracles. First thing Jesus did to show that He was not just a normal man. Okay? Anybody have anything to add to that one?
The Amplified versions, he's displaying his great power openly, like he's showing that he's God.
I just wonder what those people that, saw, the wise men came, the star,
Yeah.
Wonder what they were at that party.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Wonder what those people thought. Okay, they didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. I mean,
And his
so,
brothers.
Yeah.
It says in the next verse that his mother and his brothers and his disciples all went to Capernaum. And so,
Yeah.
like, they were there at the wedding, the brothers
Yeah.
were, but
Yeah.
they did not believe in Jesus
They
until
didn't.
much later, after his
Mhm.
death.
Wow.
All right, so this water into wine, we could see a relationship between the water and the wine with God. It's the water. The water can be like the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, and the wine is like the New Covenant God has in Jesus Christ. Like in His blood. The wine was after the water, so the New Covenant was after the Old Covenant. The Old Testament came, Jesus fulfilled, and said, "This is a new covenant in my blood." So the New Covenant started. The wine came from the water, just like the New Covenant came from the Old Covenant. So the New Testament came from the Old Testament.
Why don't you explain what a covenant is?
A covenant is an agreement between two parties, and it's a binding agreement. And so basically what happened in this culture was they would take an animal and split it in two, put half and half on each side, and they walk through it. And they would say that our agreement is binding, and if one of us breaks it, then let what happened to this animal happen to us. I mean, it was a very serious thing. It's more than a promise. Well, God, with Abraham, made a covenant, and God put Abraham to sleep and made a covenant with Himself. He split the animal and walked through it, and said, "If I don't keep my covenant, then let that happen to me." So God's the only one who can actually keep the covenant. And so it was a serious binding agreement. And so That's where we get the Old Testament from. And then when Jesus came, he said, this is a New Testament in my blood. Jesus was offering himself as the sacrifice for the new covenant. And so it's another binding that Jesus is saying, you know, if I don't keep it, then I should die again. And so, you know, like I said, it's more than a promise. It's more than a contract. It's something much, much deeper. And so when it talks about Old Covenant, New Covenant, it's talking about before Christ and after Christ, or before his death and after his death, during resurrection. So the wine was after the water, like the New Covenant's after the Old Covenant. Wine was from the water, so the New Covenant came from the Old one, because the Old Testament prophecies were all, or the New Testament's all contained in the Old Testament prophecies. And then the wine was better than the water, just like the New Covenant in Christ is better than the sacrificial covenant of the Old Testament. Christ was the sacrifice once and for all. We don't have to bring rams and bulls and sheep anymore because of the suffering of Christ. Any questions on that? I mean, it was a deep covenant. And
Deep. We're deep in here.
yeah. Now, this beginning of signs was the first of 7 signs presented in the Gospel of John. There's that number 7. God, throughout the Bible, the 7 is the theme throughout the whole Bible. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus only did 7 miracles. As a matter of fact, we'll get to this when we get to John chapter 20, but John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31 says, "And truly Jesus did many other signs and in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." John recorded these 7 to show that Jesus was the Christ. Okay, it doesn't mean that's the only 7 that he did. It just means that's all he did. And it also in the Bible, I can't remember which book it is. I'll have to look it up. But it mentions that if they wrote down everything that Jesus did, there would not be able to be a book to contain them on this earth. So there's a lot of things Jesus did that were not recorded. But the 7 things in John that are recorded in chapter 2 was water into wine. Chapter 4, he healed the nobleman's son. Chapter 5, he healed at the pool of Bethsaida. In chapter 6, he did the feeding of the 5,000 and walked on water. In chapter 9, he healed the man born blind. And in chapter 11, he raises Lazarus from the grave. All those point that Jesus is the Son of God. Because I don't know of anybody else that can walk on water like Jesus did.
Did Peter do it?
But he did it because he looked on Jesus, but then he sunk. Jesus walked from the shore all the way to the middle. So
Walked on water because Jesus allowed him
yeah,
to.
Jesus allowed him to.
Then when he stopped focusing on
And
Jesus,
Yeah.
he fell. That's when he
Yeah, when he took his eyes off Jesus, he sank.
And that's what happens to us,
Yep.
exactly.
It
Another
does.
metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Lee, is this the same Canaan as the Promised Land?
Well, no, this is Cana.
Different.
Yeah, and Canaan is the region.
Uh-huh.
Cana is the city.
All right, okay.
Yeah. Okay, verse 12. So after this feast, and then water and the wine, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. So Jesus had brothers and sisters. Of course, there were half brothers and sisters, but he had other brothers and sisters. And like she mentioned earlier, they didn't believe that he was the Messiah. They didn't believe he was the... Now, Mary did, of course,
Yeah, she
but the
did.
brothers and sisters did not at this point. Matter of fact, you can read in other parts that they thought he was crazy. Because they were, when he was preaching, they said, your mother and your brothers have come to get you. to take him back home because they thought he was crazy. Yeah. But Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. Okay, we don't know how many sisters he had, but he does have 4 brothers. James, and I don't know, somebody else's translation. Can you look up Matthew chapter 13? Mine says like Hoses or something like that, but it's because I think it's the way it was translated.
Which verse?
55 and 56.
Then they scoffed. He's just a carpenter's son, and we know Mary, his mother, and his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. All his sisters live right here among us. Where did he learn all these things?
Okay, so James and Joseph and Simon and Judas was his brothers. And James is the one who wrote the book of James. So eventually he does come to know Jesus. And Judas is the one who wrote the book of Jude. So another brother who came to know Jesus. I mean, I think seeing him die and raising from the dead, he probably
Yeah, that make you
he'd probably make you believe, you know. But you know, those are the 4 brothers that he had, and we don't know how many sisters he had. But but he did have more than one because it says his sisters. So we
All
know
his sisters.
Yeah, all his sisters. So we know he had multiple sisters, 2 or more. So. Now, some people say, well, brothers refer to his disciples, and that's not true, because in John chapter 7, we see that his brothers didn't believe in him like she was talking about. Well, his disciples did. So it couldn't be his disciples. They couldn't just, like we do, call our fellow Christians brothers and sisters. And, these were actually his brothers. Capernaum, okay, so we have the Sea of Galilee. Cana is about right here. Capernaum is going to be up here, kind of on the north side of Galilee. Okay? And that ends up being Jesus' adopted home. That's also where Peter lives, where Peter's from. And Jesus ends up using that as kind of his base, in his ministry. He comes and goes through Capernaum. Okay, verse 13. And the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, every year, a Jewish person was required to go to Jerusalem for 2 of the feasts. The Feast of Passover was one of them, and I think it was the Atonement was the other. I'd have to look that one up. No, I don't think it was booths, because they can build booths where they live. I think it was Atonement, or Yom Kippur, but I do know that Passover was one of them. All the males from a certain age have to go to Jerusalem. And so being a Jewish man, head of household, followed the law, he went to Passover. And that's where he went. And when he got there, he, this Passover was a feast that commemorates God leading Israel out of Egypt from all the idol worshippers from Egypt. And he was leading them to the promised land. They had to paint the doorposts and God passed over. That's how it got its name, the Passover. Okay?
Okay, I got a question that may sound really dumb. As a teacher, there's no dumb question, right?
That's right.
So, what do they do on Passover now?
They still have the Passover. They just
What's the ceremony of Passover?
They have a Seder.
Yeah. Well, what it is they were told
They
to
have a
keep the
ritual.
Passover as a remembrance of when they were led out of Egypt for all generations. So they're still having this Passover to commemorate them leaving Egypt.
Okay.
Now, it really points to Jesus. Everything in the Passover meal all points to Jesus. But they don't know that. To them, it's still just celebrating the fact that God let them out of Egypt.
Oh,
That's
okay.
still what they're seeing it as. And if you want to read about the Passover, anybody that's going to be,
This is what it is.
where God instituted it, Exodus
do now.
chapter 12
They have
talks
a
about
whole
the Passover.
ritual with their meal
And Leviticus 23 tells you when it's got to happen, because it happens the same time every year.
I've been to one.
Exodus and Leviticus.
Yeah, Exodus 12, verse
You
27,
have to have a
and then
rabbi
Leviticus
do it.
23:5.
You have to be Jewish to do it.
The Passover always happens on the 14th day of the Jewish first month, called Nisan. For us, in our calendar, it happens around March or April. It's not the same as Easter, even though when Jesus was crucified, it happened on that at the same time. But Easter is based on the moon. It's the first full moon after the spring equinox.
It's pagan,
Yeah,
a pagan marking.
that's how we determine Easter, is the first full moon after the spring equinox. But for the Jews, it's the 14th day after the new moon of their first month. So
So
when
it's
they-
not on the same
They're-
day. as
well,
the
not
new
on the
moon.
same as our calendar, but on
That's
their
what I'm
calendar it
saying.
is.
The 14th day after the first new moon could be a different day every year.
Because that's why it's different on our
Yeah.
calendar. But their months did not start until from new moon to new moon. That's how they did their months. And it was their first month of the year, and it was always the 14th day of that month, and it was always going to be a full moon. Because from new moon to halfway in between, between it's going to be a full moon, and then by the end of the month it goes back to a new moon.
So that's every 3 months, isn't it?
Do what?
It's every 3 months?
No, it's once a year, but it's they.
The first one.
Yeah, they have 12 months, but then where we have leap year, where we haven't had an extra day, they have like a leap month. Like every so often they'll throw in a 13th month that year to keep everything in line. It's kind of, you have to research Jewish, the way
I have,
Jewish,
I have one Jewish
Yeah.
friend, so I don't know much about it.
yeah. But that's when it is. They call it the month of Nisan. And that was actually the day Jesus was crucified. Was on Passover.
Passover. It was Passover lamb.
Yep. All right. So like I said, if you want to read about that, it's in Exodus. But they had to have a lamb without blemish. They had to sacrifice it. No, without blemish means no marks. You can't have any scratch. You can't have any bald spot. You can't have anything wrong with it. And so during this time, the lamb without blemish symbolized without sin. That's why Jesus was the Passover lamb, because he was the only one without sin. But during this time, the Jewish leaders, they were supposed to inspect, you're supposed to get it from your flock, bring it, and they're supposed to inspect the lamb and make sure it was without blemish, and then that's what you offer sacrifice. Instead of doing that, they decided, well, what if we just sell the lambs at the temple? They won't have to bring their own. We already know these are without blemish. They would buy a lamb from us and just sacrifice that. So they would make money that way. And then not only that, but we can't take coins with Caesar's face on it. It's against the rules to have a coin with Caesar's face in the temple. So you got to exchange your coins over here for a fee to temple coins to buy your lambs, so they would make double money. So it was a scam.
Money
Yeah,
laundering.
exactly. And this is what Jesus walked in on. And not only that, is the place that they decided to have this trade,
Set up shop.
set up shop, have all these animals, was in the Gentile quarter that was supposed to be set aside for Gentiles to pray. But since the Jews didn't like Gentiles,
So they didn't care.
they didn't care. So the Gentiles had no place to come and pray at the temple. Because they had the Gentile quarter, they had the women's quarter, and then the part that only men
So
could go
then
into.
the Gentiles full of land.
Yeah, and Gentiles full of all the
Money
trade,
changers.
money changers and all that stuff. So my question is how many times did Jesus cleanse the temple?
I can't answer.
It was upset.
But
Once.
did he do it more than once? Did he kick him out more than once?
He only needed to do it once.
I thought I was gonna say it was just once that I know of that he
Okay.
went in there and knocked all that off.
So here's where it might make you think. Let's look at verse 14
Then John,
in John. And he found the temple and those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers sitting. And having made a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen and poured out the money changers, coins, and overturned the tables. And to those who sold the doves, he said, take these things away. And pay attention to what he says here. Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. And then his disciples remembered it was written, zeal for your house has consumed me. Okay, so there's the account in John. But when you go back to Matthew, now remember, this is right after Cana. But when you go back to Matthew, chapter 21, verse 12, it says, then Jesus went into the temple of God. This was after the triumphant entry. Okay, where he rode in on the donkey. Then it says, then Jesus went to the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple and overturned the tables of money changers and seats of those who sold doves. And this is what he said, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves.
He
Two
says
different
something-
things he says.
he says something different.
John happened at the beginning of his ministry. Matthew says this one happened at the end.
beginning and the end.
So twice.
Twice.
It was twice that this
And he says something different in both of them. In John, he says, take these things away and don't make my Father's house a house of trade. But in John chapter 2, he says, in Matthew, he says, my house is a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. One's at the beginning of the ministry and one's at the end.
Well, Ben, how old was Jesus at this time?
About 30.
Okay.
Yeah, he was about 30 at this time when he began his ministry.
I think it's significant that he did it at the beginning and in the end because that's why he came, is to be the ultimate sacrifice. But many, many times during his ministry, he called out the religious leaders
Yeah.
and said that, they were whitewashed tombs or, they were full of dead men's bones. And, so I think that it was significant that at the beginning he said, this is what I came to do, is to clear out my Father's house and to make it a better
Yeah.
place. And then at the end, he's like, well, I got to do this again because this is
They're
the only
back.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're back.
Yeah.
They're back.
And something that's kind of significant about the temple here is when Solomon built the first temple, fire come from heaven when God entered the temple. His Shekinah glory. Well, then the Babylonians came and destroyed the temple. And then when Cyrus gave permission to rebuild the temple, there was no fire or Shekinah glory coming from heaven. God didn't enter the temple. So the temple was bare.
That was man-made. Man-made
Yeah.
that.
So when Solomon built it, God came, and then when he left, he did not return to the temple until Jesus came. So the temple was without God until Jesus came, and he came back to his temple, and he finds it a mess. Does he do that in the church a lot today? When we start a church, it's all, it's about God's business. We love. But the longer the church there, a lot of times we let the money changers come in. We let different things come and creep into the church. And Jesus needs to come and cleanse our churches a lot of times.
Is that the same way like, I don't mean to knock the church down, gotta get money somewhere, like selling hats and stuff like that?
Well, I'm not saying selling hats are wrong, but the question is why are you selling them? Is it for His glory or to
It's
line
for
your
the-
pockets?
It's for the church.
That's what I'm saying, even at the church.
Because you have to pay for the electricity.
Well, yeah,
have
you
to
do.
pay.
And I'm not saying making money's wrong.
Mhm.
What I'm saying is, whose glory is it for?
God.
You
I
know?
feel like we wear hats and shirts to advertise to people that
The whole
don't go to
church.
church or people that don't have a church home to come to this church. It's a friendly church. We'll have you, you know. I feel like that's why I wear a t-shirt or a hat. I don't feel like that the reason why
That's what
the
happened
church
with
is
that.
selling things is to make a profit, because I'm fairly certain they're not making one.
Well,
Yeah.
it may be for like, you know, missions, or it may be
I mean,
to,
they're literally
but
selling
it has to be
like
for God's
Yeah, that's what I'm
work.
saying, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm not
it's gotta be
saying,
it's gotta be for God.
yeah,
$$17.
you know, I'm not saying fundraising or making money is wrong, but, are you making money for your own self, or are you trying to raise money for God's glory? So, you know,
Just
Even
like
if you're
who
trying to
you-
make
It's
a
for God's
profit,
glory, really.
even if you're trying to make a profit, what are you putting that profit into?
you're right.
But also is like when you leave to go to church, are you going to church for you, or are you going to work for God?
Right.
Or going to church for God?
Are you going to church to be seen of people,
Yeah.
saying, I was at church today? Or are you going to church to worship God?
Right.
Worship God.
Yeah. You know, then that's a question each one of us has to ask ourselves, because I can't answer for Sam, and, you know, Sam can't answer for him. I have to answer that for myself,
Yeah.
you know? And, you know, so it's what heart do you have when you're doing these things? You know, here's the difference between the Jews and the first Christians. The Jews used the temple to do business. They were making money off of this. Not for the glory of God, but to line their own pockets.
Yeah.
And,
we're putting it back into the ministry.
yeah, and the first Christians, on the other hand, in Acts chapter 2, it says, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They sold their possessions and goods and distributed them among all as anyone had need. You know, is the church raising money to help those in need, to glorify God? If that's the case, then that's a good thing. Or is the church raising money so the pastor can get a new boat? That's probably not a good thing. you know what I'm saying? I mean, yeah. You know, so, or, yeah, or buy that new private jet, you know?
You know, that was a lot of criticism on Oral Roberts, you
Yeah.
know. A lot
There's
of-
still a lot of criticism on Joe Osteen, too.
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
true.
You know, so I mean, that's what, but
I
like I
mean,
said.
we're not here to judge.
No, I'm not
No.
calling anybody by
No,
name.
no,
I mean,
But you would have to figure that out in your own
Yeah.
court.
It's,
And I
That's
don't
it.
know that with their starving children and people that have need, that I would ever need a private jet.
yeah. But
That's
is it
just
wrong to
my
go buy yourself a
opinion,
boat?
you know?
No, it's not. It's not wrong to buy yourself a boat.
Yeah.
You know, but what I'm saying is, what's more important? You know, that's what we got to ask ourselves. You know, are we like the Christian church, or are we like the Jewish temple?
Christian.
You know, and that's what we need to ask ourselves. You know, I was reading this, and it says, if you are an accountant, dentist, financial advisor, doctor, lawyer, teacher, particularly at a large church, do you use your God-given skills to help struggling members of your church who need help? Or do you attend your church with an eye of drawing people more to your business?
Oh, I think that happens a lot.
You know,
Networking
right. You know,
at church.
are you volunteering at the church? You know, I mean, it doesn't mean that you're not, you know, someone comes to your office, you're not, you know, making a profit, but that's your living.
If you have certain gifts in certain areas,
Yeah.
that's what you should be doing, is doing that for the glory of God.
And I see this at our church, that, you know, someone was having problems, heart or whatever. Anybody with medical experience was all there trying to help.
Yeah.
That's the way it should be.
Yeah.
Whether you're going to be like, well, can I build this guy? No, they're there because they love.
Right.
And that's the way it should be. You're there using your skills, because God gave you those skills. You may work hard to learn those things, but God gave you the ability.
That's right.
Are you using it for His glory?
Well, just like if somebody has a need in the church, then, you should go help them.
Exactly. If you have that ability, go help them. And, but once again, we have to ask ourselves, is that what God, is that our, do we have that ability to help? Sometimes we don't. But if we do, then we need to. And I'm speaking to myself too. We all need to. The Bible says, I don't even have the verse down here. I'll have to look that up and let y'all know what the verse is. But it says, "For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what then will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God?" God's going to judge the church before He starts judging others, because we're the ones that are entrusted with His word. Think about it throughout history. Who did God judge first? He judged Israel, because they were entrusted with His law. And then after He judged Israel, He judged the ones He used to judge Israel, like Babylon. He used Babylon to judge Israel. And then when the time of Israel's judgment was over, He judged Babylon for what they did to Israel. Now, He didn't make Babylon attack Israel, so that's what you got to think about. He just removed His hand and allowed it to happen. But then He judged the ones who did it. But He judged Israel first, and then He judged the ones who attacked Israel. And that's the same thing here. Judgment begins in the house of God, and then everywhere else. Because the churches who don't serve God end up being dead churches.
Yeah, they fall.
They end up collapsing or closing or whatever, because
I've
God.
always heard that if the church does close, and for some reason, if you put something in there, like a business or something, it would close too. I've always heard that.
Yeah.
That that's made for God, so
Right.
you're not gonna glorify a business in it, because
Yeah.
you're really supposed to be there to glorify God.
Because a church can thrive with 4 people.
Yeah.
So
We can
if
do
they're
that
if they're on
church
fire
thing.
for God. But if it's a dead church, God has judged it. All right, verse 18. Then the Jews answered and said to Him, "What sign can you show us for doing these things?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, they did question Jesus, "Why are you doing this?" They knew it was wrong. They questioned, "What sign can you show us to say you have this authority?" Not the fact that, He was doing it, but, show us the sign that you have the authority to do this. And Jesus said, "Destroy this temple." He's talking about Himself. Not the temple made by human hands, but this temple. And, of course, the Jews were thinking materialistic, and they were thinking the temple. And they were like, it took 46 years to build this temple. And you're going to destroy, or you're going to rebuild it in 3 days? And so they did not understand what He said, or what He was meaning. He was talking about Himself. And He was talking about, "I will raise Myself up."
In 3 days.
Now, it's interesting that He says this, because there's different parts of the Bible. In John, He says, "I will raise Myself up from the dead." In Romans, it says God the Father raised Jesus from the dead. And then in another part of Romans, it says the Holy Spirit raised Jesus from the dead. So Jesus raised Himself from the dead, God the Father raised Him from the dead, the Holy Spirit, the Trinity again, together as one. All at the resurrection.
All 3.
Yeah. And so once again, it points to the Trinity. In verse 20 is where they said it took 46 years to build the temple, and you raised it up in 3 days. And in 586 BC is when Babylon destroyed the temple, and then when they were conquered by Persia, Cyrus gave them the permission to go rebuild it, and it took them 46 years to rebuild it. And so they were astonished that he said he could do it in 3, but he was talking about himself. Verse 21 says, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered what he said, and they believed the scriptures and the word of God. So when he raised from the dead, it pointed all those who heard him speak back to him. And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is pointless. 1 Corinthians says, if the dead do not rise, then let us eat, drink, and for tomorrow we die. So what it's saying is, if the resurrection ain't true, then Christians should be pitied above all things. But because the resurrection is true, then Christianity stands. And they have tried to disprove the resurrection over and over and over and over, and they can't find reason for it not to be true. The last 2 verses. Now this is verse 23. Now he was in Jerusalem during the Passover feast. Many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he did. So he did do signs, just not publicly in front of the priests. But Jesus did not commit himself to them because he knew all men and had no need that anyone should testify about man, for he knew what was in man. So he didn't commit himself to them because he knew what was in their heart. They only believed in him because of the miracles. Show us some more. Just like we see a magician. Oh, show us some more, show us some more. They didn't truly believe in him. They just believed in, seeing miracles. And so how is that different today? Jesus doesn't want people to be wishy-washy, because he's not some genie in a bottle. We don't rub and say, Jesus help me, and then that's it. He wants us to worship him very deeply, very personally, a personal relationship with him, our creator, and he wants that deep relationship with us and not some wishy-washy followers. Any questions?